All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Al Minner, Leesburg City Manager. Before we welcome everyone, I guess officially I'll call the meeting to order since this is the inaugural meeting of the Leesburg Electric Advisory Board. So we'll call it to order. We'll do a quick invocation and a pledge, and I guess I'll do the honors. So if everybody rises real quick. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to meet and discuss issues that concern the city's electric utility. We ask for wisdom and good judgment. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Our next order of business, by the way, that's only the second prayer I've done.
You did a good job.
You might have missed the last one before you left as a commissioner. John Christian.
Rub a dub dub, thanks to Grub.
Actually, I had to write it. I wrote out a prayer. I kept it just in case I ever had to do it again, so I probably should have pulled it out. So if John Christian is watching, there you go. John, that's the second prayer. Okay, so in any case, we need to just formally select an officer, so we need a chairperson and a vice chair. So typically, we just open up the floor for someone to throw out a name.
Tim's sitting in the chair seat, so.
That sounds like.
I know how to chair.
There you go. There you go. With any others, so being no other motions, it looks like.
Well, there you go.
Tim, you are the chairperson, so if
Thank you very much. I'm not going to have a speech or anything like that.
So now we need a vice chair.
Nominate Jesse.
I'll second that.
All right, throw it back to me, Mr. Chairman.
What?
Throw it back to me, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, throw it back to you. You got it.
There you go. So we are now on item 3, if you're paying attention. I just wanted to give a brief kind of introduction of the purpose, why we're here today, talk a little bit about what we're going to do this evening, and then we'll turn it over to this evening's presentation. The city of Leesburg is, I'm going to say, lucky enough and fortunate enough to be a special city in that we own and operate our own municipal electric utility. We actually, as you all probably know, we operate and own several utilities, from electric, water, sewer, and gas, our utilities. And we serve Metropolitan Service Area, MSA, probably of about 50,000 people and growing in Northwest Lake. Our electric territory is specific, as most of the other territories are, but in the electric world, the Florida Public Service Commission regulates utilities. There's some deviations in that, and we'll talk about those as we get going, but the number one thing every utility in the state, whether you're an investor-owned utility, a cooperative utility, or a municipal electric utility, one thing we all report to the Public Service Commission about is territory. So every square inch in the state of Florida is drawn out, agreed to by in-depth legal descriptions on what area, what utility serves. And roughly the city of Leesburg's electric territory is the north side of Fruitland Park, from the Sumter Lake County line, moving to the east, kind of straight across till you get to about just maybe 1,000 feet east of Radio Road. Then that line goes straight down to Lake Harris, kind of comes around the lake. And then there's a section line that cuts across the top third of Lake Denham. So when you kind of get south of Singletary Park, if you find that section line, you go straight across to the county line, Sumter County line, and then back up. So if you can envision that box, that is our customer base. To date, we have about 27,000 electric customers and growing. And one of the things we do in the municipal electric utility industry is we keep track of what customers are inside and outside our corporate limits. So of 27,000 customers, we're about 50-50. 50% of the customers are inside corporate limits and 50% are outside corporate limits. The electric industry is changing in the state of Florida. I've been in the electric utility industry about 30 years with probably a respite of that industry for about 10 years when I was in Sebastian, Florida. But all the other cities I've managed have had an electric utility. In fact, is one of the reasons I came to Leesburg was to get back in the electric industry. So things have changed, but things remain the same. But I think one of the things that we've always talked about in the municipal electric industry is influence from investor-owned utilities, a tightening market, and a need to ensure that our customers are properly represented. That is really the genesis of why the city back in 2017, we created this advisory board. For lack of interest, lack of need, the board was really never filled out. But really recently, it was the last legislative session just this year in 23, and that's why I started the story with the industry's changed, but it hasn't really. In the 30 years that I've been in the business where we've always talked about the coming storm, the legislation last year, or in 23, was really the catalyst that I saw for the first time that, wow, that things are really starting to heat up. And I think they're starting to heat up in terms of representation, in terms of pretty much the squabble between investor-owned utilities and municipal utilities is that we're smarter about how we consume electricity. We're more efficient. Loads aren't growing as fast as we projected back in, say, early 2000s. And so there's been more of a watchdog on us to make sure that we're competitive, to make sure that we're spending our monies correctly, and there is more of a fight over the available customer base. And so what we've seen in the past couple of years is investor-owned utilities starting to slip into taking over municipal electric utilities, purchasing other smaller investor-owned utilities. And long story short, I think that was the catalyst for what started the legislation in the state capitol this past year. There's other sides to that story that narrowed down, and as we talk more, we'll get into it. The most recent one was with GRU, Gainesville Regional Utilities. But it's kind of all rooted back to that dichotomy I told you. So your purpose is to kind of function as a utility authority. I don't want to steal too much thunder from Mike because he's going to talk to you about the types of ways you get your electric provisions in the state of Florida. It's investor-owned utilities, co-ops, and municipal utilities. Mike is going to talk to you about that. But your purpose is to kind of sit as an authority and advise the commission on operations, on capital improvements, and ultimately rate making. To be able to do that, you need to know a little bit about electric. Not a lot, but a little bit. So tonight's purpose is really to go back and talk about Electricity 101. So if we were taking a college course, you need to know the basics, and you need to know the divisions of how power goes from a power plant to how you turn it on in your house. Without that kind of rudimentary discussion, we'll talk about stuff that you're going to be making recommendations on that you don't have a basis for. With no disrespect to anybody, Dan is the most up to speed because of his time on the commission, and he represented us. So I think that was an important member to the committee. So tonight is Power 101. With that, I'm going to introduce Mr. McCleary. Mike McCleary is a former employee of Ocala Electric Utilities. And after he was done working in Ocala, he moonlighted for a short term with FMPA. FMPA is the Florida Municipal Power Agency. FMPA is the organization who actually purchases the wholesale requirements for the city of Leesburg. And other utilities. So, Mike, without further ado, why don't you come on up? Mike's got a presentation. He's going to give you Electric 101.
Good evening. Thank you. So, this is pretty broad stuff, and so forgive me if I cover things that you already know.
And Mike, might need to put you at the mic.
Sorry.
Yeah, because we're videoing it. It goes out in
Gotcha.
TV land.
All right. So forgive me if I cover areas that you already know, but the concept is to make sure that everybody starts from the same position.
And there might be a slide or two in here that you get a copy of just to have for the conversations in the future, so that you're like, which part of this are we talking about today, right? If that kind of helps with the discussion. So just kind of broad strokes. I like this particular photograph. It just kind of demonstrates how reliant we are on what our world is like, and can you imagine what it is without that? And just kind of where we are today. I'd like to show you what that would look like from, say, 1900, but unfortunately we didn't have the space agency at the time to help us with that. But it kind of gives you an idea on where we are today. And just to know, it hasn't always been as common, right? This is a postcard from a cooperative utility in Texas where it's 1942. Somebody had a power failure, and they sent in a postcard and said, "Hey, my lights are out. Could you please send somebody to fix it?" Right? This is 1942. I don't know how long it took to get from the home to the back, but you can imagine people weren't as, let's just say, concerned about getting their lights on right away as we have come today to expect. So the basics of kind of where we are. There's and the caveat to all of this, everything we talk about is broad strokes. We could probably find some unique forms of these things, but when I talk about it, there's three basic types of utility here in the Florida area: investor-owned utilities, Duke, Florida Power Light, TECO being specific; municipally owned utilities, which is the various cities that have systems, and then the cooperatives. The Rural Electric Authority was formed in the early 1930s, I'd say. And so the idea when we talk about margins, we're talking about and the term margin is important for us. It's the difference between what does it cost me to deliver the product to the end customer, and then whatever is left over at the end, and what do I do with that, and where does it go? And so in investor-owned utilities, typically that margin would go to a stockholder, right? Somebody who invested it in, and they're getting their rate of return. And these aren't good or bad, it's just a form of business. So municipal-owned utilities, that margin, whatever is left over in between delivered and cost, that tended to go back to the community. And it's not always in a very specific spot. Typically it's broad strokes when we talk about community, but that's kind of beside it. When we talk about cooperatives, the Rural Electric Authority, it was formed when it wasn't practical to have a light bulb 20, 30 miles in the middle of nowhere, right? The idea was to try to electrify the United States. And so that program was put together to encourage electrification across the country. And so where the municipals and the investor owns, we think of our systems in how many meters do I have in a mile of wire? In cooperative world, it's how many miles of wire to a meter. It's a completely different thought process. And so that's the typical for a cooperative. And what makes y'all unique is you have SECO here, which is a cooperative, but because of the villages and how overly dense that is, it's just a unique format. When you hear about cooperatives, generally speaking, it's usually a much different business model than what you see at SECO, and when you look at the villages and how dense that is. It's not that way at Clay Electric Co-op, which is out in the Ocala National Forest. It's a completely different utility. So anyhow, just kind of broad strokes. These are the three structures that we look at when we talk about what types of businesses there are and where does that margin go.
Hey, Mike, if I can,
Yes,
if
sir.
you flip back, and
Sure.
I'm not going to jump in, and I
Yep.
promise to keep my mouth shut. But just, Mark's kicking me under the table. just kind of as a rule of thumb, of all the three utilities in the state,
Yes, sir.
75% of the customers in the state are covered by the investor-owned utilities. Those investor-owned utilities are Duke, which is our neighbor, Florida Power and Light, which is the big giant in the state, and probably one of the biggest IOUs in the nation, yeah. At TECO, and then there's the one up in there in the Panhandle.
Florida, yeah.
Florida Public
Yes, thank you.
Utilities
Florida
or
Public
something like
Utilities,
that.
yes.
Which is actually pretty small. So 75% of the state is covered by investor-owned utility. That leaves municipals and co-ops to cover the last 25%. And that's about down the middle. So about, what's that, 13 and a half, is that the number I need? 13 and a half is investor or cooperatives, and then the other 13.5% is municipal electric utilities. And in the state of Florida, there's 33 municipal electrics, and I think there's 6 co-ops. So between those organizations and those entities, that gets everybody's lights turned on in Florida. So those are important numbers, I think, to have in your head.
So just to kind of break down the system, again, let me throw out another generality. When we talk about these voltages, right, when we say that it's generated at 14,000 volts, that is not the exact number. Depending upon your generating unit, it might be 13,000 something, or it might be 12,000 something. It depends upon the unit. So these are all generalities when we talk about this, and there's usually a broad range, and it depends. There's a lot of variation on why it's that way. But just to kind of give you some broad strokes, it's generated somewhere around the 14,000 volt range. From there, the voltage is stepped up, and it goes on to the transmission system. It goes across the transmission system, whatever distance that is between the source and the customer. And then it goes into a distribution area where that's us. Here at Leesburg, we have a distribution area where the voltage is then transformed again to carry around the system. At somewhere, for y'all, it's 12,470 volts. We know what that is specifically, but in any sense, that's your distribution voltage, and then it's stepped down for the customer. So just kind of broad strokes, that's the big picture of how it starts at the generating unit, and it works its way to the customer. So to get a little more specific, without getting too deep into it, there's a variety of types of generation. Top left is steam turbine, gas turbines. For us, the bulk of our fleet that we generate electricity from are combined cycle, which is essentially a massive jet engine that burns natural gas. That natural gas turns that jet engine, and that creates electricity. The steam that comes off of that from trying to cool that turns another generator. Right, so you wind up with both of those forms. You don't, far less losses is really what we're talking about. In that combined cycle, you have two different things, and by doing that, you are actually using more of the energy that you're from the gas, turn it into electric. And to keep in mind, when we talk about electricity, it's really just moving energy. It's cheaper to move electricity from the source to your house than it is to carry a can of gas, right? This is my energy source. I'm going to convert it into something I can transport, and I can carry it around. Sometimes I carry it around on my phone. Sometimes I carry it around on wires, right? But that's really what we're doing. We're just trying to move it. Internal combustion engines, these are the kinds of things you're accustomed to. Maybe the generator at your house is an internal combustion engine. They come in larger scales. There was a time when many of our communities were actually run on oil or diesel generators. So hydroelectric, you can think about the Hoover Dam. There is one hydroelectric facility here in Florida, the Jim Woodruff, up in the Panhandle by Chattahoochee. Wind turbines, trouble with wind turbines, we don't have a good, for us, wind turbines don't work well for Florida. There's just not that kind of wind here, a good steady wind to keep them going, right? Photovoltaic solar panels, you're accustomed to that. We've seen them. We talk about them a lot. Again, the value of installing them, there's always an exchange. No matter which one of these we talk about, there's a cost, and is there a value? And everybody has to make their own decisions on where that breaks for you. So, and then the biofuel is the kind of stuff that you hear about. I have the trash facility that there's methane gas coming off and it's getting burnt. That's a biofuel. We're going to take all the tree limbs and weeds and whatever, and we're going to burn that and spin another turbine. That's another type of biofuel. Those types of things. Also, the grease from McDonald's going into your diesel truck, biofuels, right? So this is the source for our generation. There's a variety of them, and we don't need to get into the what's better or worse. That really does fit. It's really about where you are in the world and how that works for you. The transmission system, if you think about it like the turnpike, right? Very limited access, large structures, large conductors, right? And so most of those systems are owned by investor-owned utilities. Some municipalities have small pieces of transmission structures, but by and large, it's owned by the big guys. They can afford to do that. So keep in mind that somebody's got to pay for that when they use the highway. It's like paying a toll when you're on the highway. And so if you think about the generating station, wherever it happens to be located, we have several. From there, the electrons are dumped into a pool. That pool is then, the straws are then the transmission system that draws those electrons out and deliver it where it goes. You may or may not get the electron that's literally generated for you. There's just a big pool, and they're all together, and it's taken to wherever is the path of least resistance. So that said, one more thing just to kind of note, the transmission lines, you don't just go build your own. You can't just run out and, hey, let's get into business. There are regulations to keep that from happening. Nobody wants one of these in their backyard. And usually when that happens, it's a pretty big undertaking. And so you don't just go out and start building these structures.
Does the PSC set the rates for use of transmission, or is that just set by
It's not the PSC. In my mind, it's not the PSC. I don't know. There is an organization that sets the rates, but I don't believe it's the Public Service Commission. That's outside my skill set. But I do know that it's a regulated rate. It's not just so. When we get to the distribution system, now here we are at the utility level, right? The distribution utility level. When we get here, typically the first spot we're looking at is the substation. There's several of them throughout your community. And so inside there's going to be large, maybe 2 large transformers, and it's going to step that voltage down from the delivery voltage to something that's common to your community, and it makes it easier to kind of move around, and it puts it at a level that your regular employees are able to deal with, and it's up and down the streets. So there's the transformers in there, and by the way, I really have simplified this. I could go lists and lists and lists of what's inside these fences, right? But basically, there's a transformer, there's a breaker system. The lights blinking at your house, that's typically those breakers. We can get into it later if you want to talk about it. When the lights blink, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. It's telling you the system's doing its job. When they blink, that means your lights stayed on, and the problem was solved, right? So a lot of times people don't quite get that, but that's the breakers doing their job. They're turning on and off real quick to try and get the problem to stop happening, right? Then there's the communication systems, and when I talk about communication systems, those of you that may be old enough to remember putting a key in your car and turning it, right? Well, you put a key in and you turn it, it actually closed a relay. That relay then made the starter go. That's a communication system that we're talking about, right? It's trying to communicate to tell the breaker what to do and under what circumstances it's going to do those things, right? And then those can be very simple, like the key that we're talking about, or it could be very sophisticated, where you have a room with all kinds of screens and people are looking at flashing lights all over, and you're like, really, can you understand it? And yes, they do. They do a good job at that. So, but these are the basic components inside the substation. And I can tell you that the typical transformer in a substation is right around $1 million, and they can start a little bit less and go significantly higher. And their lead times are anywhere between 18 months and 36 months today. I was in management 5, 6 years ago, and we had a transformer fail, and I was like, I need a new one right now. This was before we had all the problems that we had, and that was 9 months. My emergency happened in 9 months, right? So just understand these components are critical to the system and and paying attention to them and taking care of them. So when it leaves the substation, once it's right, so in our world, we refer to it as in the fence, in the substation, and outside the fence, and literally everything outside the fence from there all the way to the house or the business is kind of what we're talking about. So there's poles and wires. We're all accustomed to that. Then there's the underground stuff, which we aren't quite, right? It's like you know it's there because it's getting there, but it's only the green boxes you happen to see. And so that's how the electricity is carried on the conductors, and it goes from there. The transformers will take that 12,000 volts and step it down to reasonable for your home or your business, right? Most homes, 120 or 240 volts, and it serves into your house on service conductors. And so I marvel at the idea that as hazardous as this stuff is, as hazardous, we all know, we tell our children, don't play with that stuff, it's dangerous, don't touch the wires, but yet there's 120 volts right here with me, and it's right here with me all the time, right? We're always next to it. It is relatively a safe system. We have done a really good job at creating a system that works well for us in moving energy around. So that said, we kind of touched on this with the voltages. The transmission systems have higher voltages, and because of that, those things are much more efficient. Once we start getting closer and closer, that's why we lower the voltage to make it safer, but the efficiencies are lost there, right? Now it's harder to carry the energy. We can get into the math of it in another class if you really want to go that far. So the metering part, right, that's when it comes to your home, it's a single meter, it goes in the house. All the electricity that goes in your house goes through that meter. Typical homes. I'll leave it at that. And so it's a pretty basic thing, and I used to joke with our meter people, right? They count electrons. That's what they do. How much are you using? And so it's a really important part of the process. You got to know how much the bill is. So as we get into larger and larger scales, right, there are meters at your system where the delivery point is that also counts the electrons. Same principles, just more scale, right? It's just it's more complex, but it's the same basic thing. We're still doing the same counting, 1, 2, 3, as they go by. So that's kind of there's your big strokes on what the system is and kind of how it runs. So now that we've kind of touched on, here's the generation, here's the transmission, here's the distribution of the system, and ultimately the customer, I wanted to just give you a quick breakdown. And again, wholesale costs, this is typical, not necessarily specific to anyone. It's just broad strokes. The wholesale cost of energy from the generation to the delivery point is usually between 60 and 70% of the overall delivered price. And so when you look at that, then that other 30 to 40% is what actually runs the company and what takes care of all the internal stuff. And the interesting part of that is, when we look at this is a much more complex part. The closer you get to the house or the business, the much more complex, the more people, wires, stuff you need. But yet, it's a smaller portion of the overall. And that's relative to fuel and whatever. We'll let the economists deal with you on that conversation if you want to go that far. But just to kind of understand how this breaks out. When we talk about wholesale, we're talking about from your supplier, which is FMPA, and then the transmission lines, how to get it here. They get a certain percentage of it, and that's a regulated cost. And then what happens internally is relative to your operating and maintenance costs, and whatever overhead is part of that.
Excuse me, so you said the 60 to 70% is regulated?
So the generation itself is not regulated because you own the generation, right? You own your generation. As a member of FMPA, you are owner members. And so the fixed cost is just that. It's a fixed cost. This is how much it costs to have this machine sitting here doing its thing. And then the variable part of that is the cost of fuel. And so by participating in the budgetary process and participating with us throughout the process, you're the ones that regulate how those prices go. And I say you, our members do.
So just to add to that, just to kind of give you a local number, the kind of there's three components there: generation, transmission, and then distribution. And then for distribution for us, I would include the metering and the customer service and all that stuff, right? So that's all part of everything that comes after the substation. So generation and transmission is what we buy from FMPA. So Mike's saying that that's typically 60 to 70% of the cost to get the electric to your house. In Leesburg, that number's probably closer to 80%. And if you all have been to our budget presentations, and so we've got the big giant book. The city commission adopts about this year it was $220 million budget. And then I always joke almost every year, I say one number in that $220 million book is 40% of that whole book, and that's the FMPA line. So, and that's not the joke. So our FMPA number is about 60 million, and it's in the electric fund. So it's about 60 million. That number covers generation and transmission. And then when we look at the electric distribution numbers, which would be personnel, operations, capital, and debt, I'm going to say rough house, 60 million for our pay FMPA. Personnel is probably around 3 million. Ops is around 3 million. Capital is around 3 million, or 6 million. It needs to be 3 million. We'll talk about that later. And then our debt's around 3 million. So add those numbers. So it's about 80% is generation and transmission. So when we start talking about fixing our prices, our costs, 80% are dictated to us because of generation and transmission.
And we have a representative on it. And I don't remember the number. So FMPA, the big number from FMPA is fuel costs.
That is correct. Yeah, it is. Yes. And so that's variable, right? And so I would say that in the past year or so, it's been as much as 50% of our cost has been natural gas, but that fluctuates, and so. There was a time where it was much more stable, is the best way to say that, when natural gas prices remained where we were. And so forgive me, I'm in member services, not in that side of the house, the generation side of the house, but I attend all the board meetings, and I can remember the conversations on saving 10 cents or 15 cents on a BTU, MMBTU of gas, where now if it was only a 10-cent swing, everybody would be tickled to death, because we have seen it swing by dollars, between 3 and 10. So yes, it can be dramatic.
And not to beat that horse to death, but so 80% for Leesburg, 80% is generation and transmission. And then Mike just said 50% of the 80% is natural gas.
Right.
So then when you look at us, and we had the big spike in power cost adjustment from a penny and a half to 7 cents to get the recovery, that's why, because of the volatility of that market. So when our rate was down there about 117 per thousand, gas cost about $2 a decatherm. Gas in that time frame for about a year jumped up to $10, $12, $15 a decatherm. Gas is now, the market's kind of come back into $4, and we put in hedging and these type of things. And so you saw us recover, then you saw us drop to the 3 cents, and then we dropped again to the 2 cents, because we've really kind of artificially ensured our costs won't exceed $4, which allows us that it's managing that 50%. So the fluctuation, that 50% has a humongous impact on that 80%.
One quick question. Are there any other companies like FMPA that Leesburg could use, or is this the only person that does this?
It's the only person that does this in the state of Florida. Okay. Every state is different, and every state's the same. So in Missouri, we had we called it MEGMUC, Missouri Intergovernmental Joint Electric Association.
In the state of Florida.
There's pretty much one for every state. You're going to have an No, we won't get there tonight.
We are actually an owner. Like, we own part of this.
Okay.
Like we own the debt,
So
everything.
all the municipal electric utilities across the state, they're either going to generate their own power, or they're going to buy it from a conglomerate like FMPA.
Okay.
So you're going to have the Georgia Municipal Power Agency, you're going to have the Alabama Power, the Oklahoma Power, Texas, blah, blah. So
It's
every
not something
state,
you go shop for.
No.
Am I correct, was it 13 or 33?
33.
33 cities, okay.
But that
Are they all?
FMPA, which we're a member of, does shop to an
They,
extent.
right. They shop to an
buy
extent for their,
generation.
we'll break down FMPA more at another time,
Yeah.
but FMPA has what they call different projects. So they'll have a project with maybe just 2 utilities, like Jacksonville Electric Authority and OUC, and they'll have a power plant that was built to serve members from FMPA, but maybe not all the members, JEA and OUC. And so, what is there, 6 projects or 5
So,
projects in FMPA?
There's the specific number, I'm not sure. So I think when a project is when a generation facility is being built, we FMPA have the opportunity to invest in that on your behalf, and that's the projects we talk about.
Right.
Where, hey, we're building Turkey Lake. FMPA and its members, whichever members decide, or St. Lucie, they decide to take a part of that. And so it may be 1/2 of 1%, right? It may be, it's minimal when you think about it in the grand scheme of things. But for y'all, it could equate to 10 or 15% of what energy
Well,
delivered.
drill down on that, you're probably bonding it, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So you're responsible for.
And then you can,
Counterpart bond.
and then there's
Yes.
layers. So you've got FMPA as the mothership, right? And then when they say a project, that means a generation project. And then there can be multiple generation projects. And then these are different requirements. Hence, the all requirements project. So you come to FMPA, we do, with 13 other cities, and we buy all our requirements from FMPA. That's one project at FMPA. And it's kind of the flagship project of FMPA is the 13.
Even though it might not be a facility that you are drawing power from.
Right. So FMPA, so that all requirements project will have different projects underneath itself where maybe we're buying a contract from OUC, or we're buying from Duke, or we're buying from FPL, or we have our own power plant. So the chart just unfolds and unfolds. So, and that's one project. And then there may be another project that FMPA is involved in, like St. Lucie, which is a nuclear project, which is the nuclear power plant down in St. Lucie County, yeah. Where FPL owns part of it. Different member cities of, I don't know all the members of St. Lucie. We're one of them. So you'll see 2 lines in the budget when we get into it. That's going to be the All Requirements Project, where we buy about 90% of our power comes from the All Requirements Project, but then some of our power comes from St. Lucie. So we're a member, Leesburg is a member of 2 projects. So whenever you hear somebody with the lapel pin that's FMPA and they say project, that means some type of generation facility.
Yeah, a couple years ago, the FMPA did a solar project. And so we elected not to participate in that one. It would have raised our cost at the time, and they'd done some surveys, and Leesburg residents were a little wild about that. But so like that was an example where they did one, and we elected not to participate, but we could have.
So does it help your rates to be a participant? Is that?
It depends. It depends. The larger, just long answer, but I'll try to be brief.
I'm
But
trying to
the
figure
answer
out
is
why
it depends.
you want to be
If you're
a member.
typically, I'm going to just roughhouse say, typically municipal electric utilities that are 100,000 customers or more, you will see that they have their own generation facilities. So the city of Lakeland owns the McIntosh plant. JEA has their own facilities, and then they'll mix it with other projects. But that number is typically 100,000 and above. So for Florida, 100,000 and above would be JEA, Gainesville, Tallahassee, which doesn't have any generation, by the way, Lakeland, OUC, Orlando Utility Commission. Those cities, less Tallahassee, are probably the big 5 in the state. All of them, but Tallahassee, have mostly their own generation, and then they purchase it. Now, as you drop down in utility size, you start seeing the utilities coming together. so that they can make generation and transmission choices that are most efficient. And it's kind of then the Walmart mentality of purchasing power. The more group you get together, the better chance you
Safety
have.
in numbers.
Safety in numbers. And so, exactly. So share the loss, share the gain, and that keeps it neutral. And that's so that it depends.
Okay.
And that's kind of what I got out of it, because I don't know if it's still the way, but when I first got on the commission, so we're ARP. Mount Dora has a utility. They were just buying open market. And at the time, they had much lower rates than us, and it was because there was an excess of power on the market at that time. But that can flip the other way,
Right.
and if you're just buying short term, and so kind of through ARP, we have guaranteed capacity and access to that. The flip side is you may not always be the lowest provider.
Well, and there's a function of that. Forgive me that we're getting off the slides, but there's a function of that that isn't discussed when we talk about straight up, this is my price per megawatt delivered. Mount Dora has to go to market. And you guys, if you haven't traveled the path, you'll find that going to market is cumbersome. It takes a significant amount of effort on staff to dedicate themselves to that process. And where you may wind up at a lower megawatt hour rate, when you get done with the negotiations, you may find that you have invested a small fortune in getting there, right? And so,
With no guarantees.
and you got to do that again in 5 years or 3 years, depending upon the thing. And so to that, there is the base price, but there's a level of administration that happens in the grand scale, in our office in Orlando, with people that deal with all of that in your name, so that you don't need to.
Who's ARP?
Great explanation.
Thank you.
Who's ARP?
What is ARP?
ARP it stands for the All Requirements Project. So ARP is one of the number of projects that FMPA manages. So FMPA, Mike's group, manages a number of projects. One of them is the All Requirements Project, of which there's 13 member cities. KUA, Kissimmee Utility Authority, Leesburg, Ocala, Fort Meade, Clewiston, Bushnell,
Key West,
Havana,
yeah.
Key West, Ocala. Did I say Ocala?
Yeah.
So those 13 cities come together, and I would say probably Leesburg, of the 13 cities, probably top 8 as far as number of customers. And typically what you see, once you get below 20, so just for comparison purposes, 33 electric utilities in the state of Florida. Leesburg probably ranks 12 at 27,000 customers. And once you get below Leesburg, then customer base, so that's the remaining 15 utilities, 1,200, 5,000, repeat 13 times.
So who manages FMPA in their budget process?
The member cities do. So
He would bring you a yearly budget of, we need to expand and get 12 more people doing blah, 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 and this is what our power costs.
So FMPA has a staff, I believe, about 80 employees.
73, and we're about to, and I say 73, that's a guess number by the number of parking spaces. But 73, and we are about to bring on 2 more facilities, which will increase our in-house, our number of employees, because of the generating plants that are coming on board. But I think kind of, if it helps, FMPA is a cooperative of cities, and we are formed, and when you look at our business model, I have a tax exempt form, and when I do business, it is like a government. It is, right? Everything I do is this for the public good? That's the basis of the work that I do. And it's the basis of the work that we do in our building. It's always from that perspective, the same as it is in this building. And so we are a cooperative of the municipal utilities. And so we function very similar to a government body. We are governed by our board of directors of the 33 members, and then there's an executive committee which is made up of the All Requirements Project. And the All Requirements Project is just that. You will take your energy from FMPA, and the members that ventured into it saying, we are all going to band together, and we're going to do this as a unit. And they did it so that the reason that you get into that is to say that you don't want people coming and going because we've issued bonds. And those bonds, you can't have people coming and going when you have that kind of liability out there.
Okay.
Dan, was that the board that you were on? Or-
I was on the policymakers committee.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Al serves typically on as
Yeah.
a voting member. You and Brad as the
Yes,
voting members of the
Brad, electric director.
that. And I would say, there is a city commissioner. I think maybe Jimmy is the
Jimmy is the, sir,
rep. But they do this quarterly meetings of policymakers, and I mean it's worth going over and just listening to one of those. If you have time at some point, because they go through kind of all this. Like here's our power cost. Here's our operational cost. Here's our target for the year. Here's kind of what's happening, and really explains how the FMPA works, geared specifically to policymakers as opposed to,
And is there always a commissioner that's
yes, it
appointed
is
for that?
correct.
Okay.
And
I'm sure they wouldn't mind someone else.
for the record, they're public meetings just like this one. You're welcome to them. They're broadcast, so you can tune in from wherever you are.
Okay, great.
You don't have to come to the office in Orlando. You're welcome to. We have plenty of space. So yes, they're public notice and they're broadcast, so you can come to them. Just kind of I want to give you a perspective on what a single event can do for you. When you look at this particular picture, I want you to notice where Key West is. Now I'm going to cut it off in the next picture because I zoom in on it. But this picture I think was taken in April or May of 2017. And so this is what the state of Florida looked like in May of 2017, and this is what it looked like the day after Irma. And so Irma came up through the center of the state, and in this next slide you'll be able to see what happened. You can see where the Keys are. And it took us a couple of weeks to get that one back going. But it just kind of gives you perspective on how fragile this system can be. And actually, as a lineman, I prefer to think of it as those lights that are still on is how robust we are. When you consider just how devastating that system was that went through. So anyhow, to that is my presentation, and if there's any more questions, I'll be glad to help.
Any questions?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
We stopped recycling because we were being told that our garbage was being used to generate power. Where's it going?
Leesburg stopped recycling because of costs. And so go back to biofuels.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's what triggered the question.
Yeah.
But there's
Go
a
back to-
sticker on my recycling bin that they put on there that said, no need to separate any longer. It's all going into one place. It's all being burned
So-
for electric.
I would put that into biofuels sections. So what we did in Leesburg was we stopped recycling because of expense and problems with the recycling chain post-COVID, because most of the recyclables were sold to China, and then after COVID, there was transportation issues, blah blah blah, all sorts of stuff. So in our backyard is an incinerator, Covanta.
Right.
So Covanta is a biosolids generator, if you will. So what they do is they burn garbage. The heat from their garbage they mix with water. That water makes steam that turns into a turbine, and they're connected to the grid. So they're their own proprietor of selling generation into the grid, and different entities buy power from Covanta. In all honesty, I don't know who the buyers of that are. FMPA, I don't believe, buys power from
If
Covanta.
we do, I'm not familiar with it.
But one of our member cities used to, and that was Winter Park. So Winter Park went through, and I don't think that's the only buyer of electricity, but that's where it goes. So the trash goes into the truck, it goes down to Covanta, it goes in the incinerator, it's burned, and so Those recyclables are burnable, and it burns at such a temperature that, they go away. And then because that's churned into fuel, electricity, cities receive credit for for green because that's considered a biofuel.
Where's Covanta? You said our backyard. Where's that?
Rogers and Hayward Worm Farm Road, right next to Arlington Ridge.
And so, pardon my ignorance, why do we not benefit from something that geographically close to us?
Because we are in the All Requirements Project. So the All Requirements Project started in late 80s, early 90s.
Late 80s.
Okay, so a group of cities came together and they formed the All Requirements Project. And the common joke is it's the Hotel California. You can check in, but you can never check out, okay? Why? Because when these group of cities came in, they sold tax-exempt bonds. By the way, tax-exempt bonds is kind of the heartbeat of why investor-owned utilities don't like municipal utilities, because our bonds are tax credits, their bonds are taxable. So there's the first argument. I had a commissioner in Fort Meade who, I don't know much about the banking business, but he's like, oh, munis are like credit unions, credit unions to the banking industry, electric to investor owned. Okay, so those cities came together, they formed a group to generate X kilowatts for the group, and they sold 30-year bonds. Part of the agreement when we shook the hand and said we're going to cut the costs and we're going to share the highs and lows is you can't get out of the group because we had to spend millions of dollars buying that block of energy. So the principle of the All Requirements Project is you cannot generate electricity because that hurts the group. Now add that into 50 years later is series of bonds, series of generation projects. And every time you initiate a new project, the same rule starts. 30-year commitment, 30-year commitment.
But it wouldn't matter anyways, because
And-
Covanta's going to sell at the market. They're not going to sell it to us cheaper because we're closer. They're going to sell at the market rate, which is the market rate. It's like you said, it's not like when you buy it from a generation, you get those specific electrons. They all go into the distribution system, spread around.
So even
Unless
though,
we could buy Covanta and actually own the incinerator,
then that would be,
but right,
But-
just buy their power.
but even in that suggestion, we buy Covanta and we build a 69 kV line to hook into all our substations. Our agreement with FMPA
Yeah.
says you can't because we have to share the costs with our partners.
And we're tied to the bonds.
And you're tied to the bonds.
Wonderful. Any other questions?
You got like 3.
Thank you.
I've got billing questions though, so I don't know if we're going to get to that or not.
We can talk about building if you like. That's down on the other side of the equation, but.
No, well, yeah, because we got to that end of it where we started talking about that. So do we bill differently for residential than we do for commercial?
Yes.
Why?
We build differently based on rate. So we have classes of customers, residential customers, commercial demand customers. So we basically have about 3 classes. I think we might have a couple of other classes in there. So let's start at residential customers. Your residential customers are the bread and butter of our system. Probably about 75% of our customers are residential customers. They have a typical load performer. They're a certain typical voltage that we talked about, the 220 volts into your house. You use it. It's a single phase, meaning you get one stream of electricity that comes into your house that turns on your lights, your refrigerator, and does everything. Easy to measure, easy to consume. We understand it, and so it has a price based on that cost. The next level of customer is a commercial customer. They typically have a little higher voltage that goes into their business, but they function kind of like a house on steroids.
Like me, right? Mine is 1,000 kilowatts.
I don't think you're a demand customer on your other side. Then you have the demand customer. The demand customer is what we refer to as a 3-phase customer. They need a higher voltage to turn bigger motors and engines, and it takes if you go out and you look at our overhead, a circuit is a series of 3 wires, what we call a phase, A phase, B phase, C phase. when you get into the McDonald's, the Romax, Catrali, they need 3 phases of energy to turn their motors. So we build them now on 2 levels. At your residence and a commercial industry, you're just paying for what you consume. But you have a peak and you have a non-peak. It's kind of like if it was water, you drink gallons, but it comes out of your faucet in a pressure. So when you're a big customer and a demand customer, we bill you for how much you peak at, how much you consume at one time, and how much you use over the course of a month. Because when Dan's cutting wood at 3 p.m., he's putting a load on the system. Then that trickles back to the generation side. So we have to build a generation facility, and there's 3 phases. We didn't get into this. We have 3 phases of generation: base load, intermediate, and peak load. The higher you go in there, the more expensive it becomes, because let's just say the number 100. 365 days a year, 25 hours a day, you're going to use 50% of 100. So you got to build a power plant that's on 365, right? Every minute of the day. That engine is on. That's called a base load. Intermediate load, a little bit less. Peaking load. You might need as much peak as you have in your base, but you're not going to use that energy all the time, but you have the same cost to build that generation. So when you peak, everything's got to go on at once, and then everything's got to turn off. How we recalculate that back, it's in the residential matrix, but on the commercial demand side, we count it even closer, because those are the contributors that really help us, cause us to peak out. So we have different rate structures. Some of the different utilities will shift the costs around so that residential rates will subsidize industrial rates, or industrial rates will subsidize residential rates. Our rate-making strategy as a municipal electric utility is try to equally divide the costs amongst all the customers. So you have tiers of rates.
And we have tiers within residential as well, correct? Based on the usage?
We tier based on the usage, but our tier is the first 1,000 is one rate, over 1,000 is another, and then we only have the 2 tiers.
So 75% is residential. Your demand customer is what, 10%?
I'll say demand in industrial is about 25%.
Okay.
For Leesburg, and every every entity will be different.
I had one of our consultants once referred to it as, think about renting a car and the family's coming. So you got 6 people that's going to ride with you, so you're going to go get a car that'll haul 6 people. Right? So you go and you pick up those 6 and you drop off 4, and now there's only 2 of us, and we're going to ride around for the rest of the month. Well, we needed that 6-person car when we first bought it, right? That's your demand. Right? How much fuel I burn the rest of the time, that's your usage. Make sense?
Oh,
Right?
Chris,
So-
what do we normally run at? How many megawatts? 80, 70?
124,
That's-
but we run probably around 100, depending on the season, you know.
So there, for example, so we'll measure our system. 24/7, we're generally running, the city of Leesburg is generally running around 100 megawatts. But in the summertime and in the wintertime too, because we're dual peak, what we call dual peakers in Florida. We peak in summer and winter. So when it's really cold, everybody runs over to their floor here, they plug it in, it spikes, right? And in the summertime, everybody's turning their AC down at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we peak. Where if you go up north, you're really only peaking in the summertime. So we're dual peakers in Florida. And so for us, Leesburg, generally we're running 90 to 100 megawatts, constantly using that. But then we peak. This year was the United States had this year the United States, everybody all put together had the highest peak in the history of electrification. We peaked this year, we broke our peak, we were, I think, 115, we went to 125. I'm using round numbers. Yep. So our peak is about 25% more of our load, probably for 3% of the time. So you kind of just keep in, kind of the best lesson I think I ever got in electrification was from a guy named Ken Wiesel from Medjmuck. You have power over time, and it's the S curve.
So we could really
Right.
lower our rates if we could just convince people that I need electricity 3% of the time.
There you
Exactly.
go. There you go. So at 3
So-
o'clock in the afternoon, you can't
so-
run those stalls down there.
So those peaks are expensive, and then if you roll that into how we buy electricity from the All Requirements Project, we do it like a demand customer. So we have a standard usage and we have a peak. So we pay a typical use charge, and then we have a peak charge. And whenever we peak, our price goes up.
And as a component of that, the transmission system's the same way. When you consider, right, what's it like at rush hour? Everybody's trying to get home at the same time. The transmission's the same way. Those facilities are, because think about it, when Leesburg's peaking, so is Ocala, so is Winter Park. Everybody's using that same wire. And so those transmission structures that you see 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, may only be at 70% of normal, but when they hit their peaks, it really is. And those prices are governed the same way.
I was going to say, so they're penalized from
That's-
the
yes.
power plant
Right.
to go peak.
Yep. And it's just a function of the way the pricing is, in order to make the pricing equitable, so that everybody pays their part. And it does encourage, right? Y'all said, talk about people. There are people that there are places that are able to adjust their rates according to that time frame. It's a challenging thing and it's an expensive endeavor, but it happens. But from what I read in the articles, it doesn't work as well as we wish it would, because the thing about electricity is it's always paid in arrears. We've already used it, right? When we put gas in the car, we're watching the pump. We see it. We just came back from wherever we were. We're able to equate that. When we're in our house and it's whatever temperature outside and we adjust our thermostat to fit that day and we feel good about it, it's going to be 30 to 45 days before we feel the pressure of what that is. So it's really hard to get prices to change my activity unless if it has a significant impact on my budget, then of course I have to do things. I'll start hanging laundry in the backyard. But if it's just an inconvenience to my budget, it's really hard to get people to control their usage that way.
One of you used Walmart as the example. As we continue to grow as a community, both on the residential and commercial side, do we get better economies of our raw cost that would potentially show up across the service area?
I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no because the All Requirements Project is designed to provide an equitable price to the cities. And the rate matrix gives you credit for whether you're a generator or a non-generating city. There's 2 or 3 cities in the All Requirements projects that bring generation to the table. And so while we all get the same rate, we start giving credits back to the cities that bring generation to the table, in addition to the other resources that we buy. So because Leesburg joined the party back in the 80s as a non-generating city, as we grow, we're growing customer base, but we're still not able to bring our own generation to the table because when we joined the party, we were a non-generating city. So we don't get scales of economies for our growth. We get scales of economy because we're in the pool.
We get scale in the other 20% though. The non-FMPA portion of the budget, the city internal portion of the budget. The part that you have direct control over, we get scale there.
Yeah, but that's like laying people off or whatever. I mean,
No,
there's reducing
no.
costs. to be
No,
able to
because
create-
as we bring people on, you're not growing staff at the same. We're not growing the city's operational budget in the electric department doesn't grow exponentially with new customers, right? You don't need a new electric director if you add 5,000 customers. You
Yeah.
need one electric director.
And it's not a break even. There's got to be a profitability there somewhere
is.
Okay.
for growth.
So, and that was my last question then. You talked early on about the margin, and the margin goes back to the city. Is there an industry standard as to what an acceptable margin is at the end of the year? I mean, I know this is constantly a fluid thing, but what's an acceptable margin?
It's a secret if you're an investor-owned utility. They'll report 6 to 10% to the Public Service Commission, that they're only making that. A rule of thumb for a city is 6 to 10%, which is seen in your transfer. So if your margin back to this general fund is within a 6 to 10% window, you're deemed to have a reasonable margin. That is exclusive of what we call the cost allocations. So the cost allocations in the city of Leesburg are, we have an electric utility, being the electric fund. That fund specifically covers the cost of power through our requirements costs, St. Lucie, personnel, debt, operations. Those are the fixed costs. However, the electric fund uses the city manager. The electric fund uses the IT department. The electric department uses the customer service department. So if the electric department was its own, the electric fund uses the city attorney. So if the electric department was its own investor-owned utility or its own cooperative, they would have fleet costs. They would have all these other costs. We take those costs and they're in the general fund. And what we do then is we divide amongst the other utilities, electric, water, sewer, gas, on the percentage that the electric fund uses the city attorney, the percentage that the electric fund uses customer service, the percentage that the electric fund uses IT. And whatever that cost is, we then charge the electric department. So we don't say that's a transfer, we say that's a cost allocation. So you have your basic costs in the electric fund, and then you have the cost allocations, and then you have the transfer. The transfer for the city of Leesburg is 6%. And then that's where we created the referendum question that said it can never go over 6%. We fixed that. And then 6% is rooted, if you want me to go further.
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is when you factor all of that in, what is your triple net margin at the end after everything is all said and done? What percentage are we talking about?
6% plus whatever cash you put in your pocket at the end of the day.
Okay, so 6% is the net.
Yes,
After you paid all of your bills and made all your transfers and everything.
6%.
Okay, and that is within an industry standard.
Yes.
In
And
fact,
it's going to be on the low end of the industry standard for municipal electric
yeah, you'll see
utilities as
cities
well.
in the 20s.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But if we didn't have an electric utility, the meters inside the city limits, so half of our customers are on, so it would imply those will inside, whatever IOU owned those would have to pay us 6% for using the right of way. And that's where that kind of number, I think,
That's where the
part of
number
the number
comes
comes
from.
from is they would pay us that.
So we're talking percentages, what kind of money are we talking? I mean, how big is the electric department?
Electric department's about 90 million this year. The transfer, I want to say, is about 4.7 million. That's the 6%. Now, there's some wiggle room in the definition of 6%, and we kept that vague. One of the hiccup in the giddy up as we get into the budget process down the road, which you guys will talk about, is do you include the cost of power in that 6%, or don't you include the cost of power? We do not include the cost of power, which decreases what we could transfer. So I'm going to tell you, we're pretty pure as a Leesburg utility on trying to minimize the number that we take out of the electric fund, and that's really the primary purpose of that is to provide the customer the lowest cost that we can.
Okay.
So $4.7 million, let's just call it $5 million to be a round number. Our millage rate in the city of Leesburg is going to be 3.74 whatever, right? 3.7 mils. We just reduced it to that this year. 3.7 mils generates $6 million, round numbers. So if we didn't have that $5 million, that means the millage rate would almost need to double to replace it.
So I have a question. This may be another meeting and another entire topic, but with the new growth coming in Leesburg, will there be new substations, and will that impact anything with this?
Yes.
So that's a big
That,
topic.
and I can do it, I can do it super quick.
I just
And I can
have to
do,
conversation.
look,
It may be a very big
I
topic
can,
that-
no, let me,
for another
let's tackle that just real, but because it's a super interesting question, and for Leesburg, it's probably gonna make us one of the most individual, differently municipal electric utilities in the state of Florida. So right now, Leesburg is about 27,000 customers, 50% in the city, 50% out of the city.
Right.
But remember, Leesburg's major growth is south of Lake Denham. That's Duke territory. I think probably in the next 5 years, we have the potential of having more Leesburg residents that are not on our electric system than are on our electric system. So that's something to watch. And that's another reason why we did the referendum about the sale of the utility, is because when you have the city commission up here, there's probably a chance that 2 or 3 of those commissioners in the future aren't going to be Leesburg customers. Right now, only one isn't, which is Commissioner Cannell, who lives in Arlington Ridge. That number is going to change as the Villages grows and all the South 27 stuff grows. That's part one to your answer.
Turnpike was insane.
Part two to that answer is, even though probably 80% of our growth is south, we have enough growth to the north in Fruitland Park and out on Radio Road, the 44 corridor, that is necessitating the need for a 6th substation. So we recently closed on a parcel of 1.4 acres over there by Pembroke Pines off of 44, where we're going to put a 6th substation.
It doesn't matter where you put the substation.
It does matter. It does matter, because the further away you get from the transmission system, the more expensive. So, and Mike's costs were exactly right. The cost of a transformer is about $1 million. There's $2 million. Then plus all the hardware and gear and switch gear, blah, 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 and engineering. Probably our long-term cost to build the 6th substation is probably going to be around $5 million. And so
I think that's a conservative number.
well, some of it we have. Well, at this stage, I don't know how we're getting there. It's one of those things that frankly, I'm going to be recommending that we kick the can down until really the load grows to such a way. But then we also
Well, it's gonna
there's
take you
lots of
2 years to get
lots of
get what you need.
lots of ingredients in that number. But yeah, six substations. So we see it on both ends how that's changing.
But we will be getting 6% on all the new growth.
I was about to say, so is there a financial gain from anything south that would be under?
Yes, everything south will operate like a non-electric city, and so we have franchise agreements with Duke and Seco, and so as we annex, they build, they have to pay us 6%. Okay, so let's go into that, because we've talked about that a little bit. So under the laws of the state of Florida, a municipal corporation has the right to provide municipal services.
You got a 180.
Municipal, that's another rule, but that's water and sewer land. So the municipal corporations provide municipal services. State statutes define municipal services as trash, electric, water, sewer. Those are municipal services. And if you're in a city's 180, 180 is a reference to a statute, then that city has the right to franchise it, like McDonald's. It's a franchise. So what non-electric cities do is they take that right of municipal service and they charge the utility, whether it's investor-owned, co-op, or city, like in Fruitland Park. And we'll get, and I want to, before we end, let me explain kind of the thought process that went into the people who are sitting here. And I point to Mark because Mark is representing Fruitland Park because he's a resident of Fruitland Park. So that's a municipal corporation, Fruitland Park, charging the city of Leesburg, another municipal corporation who's an electric utility, an 8% franchise for Leesburg having the right to serve Fruitland Park. So typically that franchise is 6%. 6% for the right to serve and 6% to use the public right-of-ways for the hardware. The other side of the equation there too is every municipal corporation has the right to provide a utility tax. The statutory maximum of utility tax is 10%. There's 600 and some odd municipal corporations in the state of Florida. Probably 99.9% of them have a utility tax, and they charge you 10%. So municipal corporations, not municipal electric utilities, municipal corporations use their statutory right to get 6% from electric service for franchise, and then they tax it at 10%. And so when you get into non-electric cities, the big three revenue sources in the general fund are your property taxes, your franchise fees, and your utility tax. Our big source of revenue in the general fund is the transfer, the property tax, and the utility tax.
So Mark could be paying more for his electricity because of the 8% than I do being in the county.
Yes, Fruitland Park has a franchise agreement with the city of Leesburg that runs, I think, on 3 5-year cycles, and I think we're probably in year 12 now, the third cycle, where the city commission of Fruitland Park said to Leesburg, we're gonna tack on 8%. And so you'll see a lot as investor-owned utilities, because it's typically an investor-owned utility who has the franchise, and it's a pass-through. So the investor-owned utilities will complain that the franchise fee artificially increases their rate, because people don't look at the bill, the details of the bill where it says franchise fee 6%. And so what we publicize when we compare rates is our rate versus their rate without a franchise fee. So, for example, Duke, I think, is hanging out around like 167 right now for the first 1,000. What you're really paying, whoever's on Duke, you're paying 167 plus 6%. So we're comparing a non-franchise rate to a non-franchise rate.
So the franchise fee goes to Fruitland Park in this particular case? So Fruitland Park is charging a tax and there's a franchise fee. Both of those lines go to Fruitland Park?
18% of your electric bill goes to Fruitland Park, yes.
So if you annex somebody in to the city that was a Sumter Electric client, are you getting the 6% from SECO?
Yes. And typically when we annex, we're annexing undeveloped parcels.
Right.
So there's no customer in that area, but it's a territory.
Right.
But if the city were to annex Fruitland Park, their rates would go down by 18%.
There you go.
Not only would your rate go down by 2%, your taxes would come down. No, actually, no, they wouldn't. I think you guys have a tick lower millage rate than we do. But yeah, but that 2% is probably larger than the differential in taxes. But so let me end on this note.
Can I ask one last question though on the margin thing?
Yes.
Does that have to stay within the utility, or does that profit margin, however much or little it is, does any of that get filtered back into the city, where you could point to things that have been done with that money? When I'm driving down the road and I see your penny sales tax at work, does the city as a whole benefit at all from the profit of the electrical utility?
Every single penny of the margin of the 6% goes to the general fund.
Right.
Okay.
That, which is $4.7 million a year, goes into the general fund.
Okay.
Since I've been the city manager of Leesburg, we have strived to reduce the transfer and keep that margin as low as possible. And we have looked to other utilities to do fund projects. Those fund utilities where there are bigger margins to play with that aren't as regulated is the gas utility. So when we entered into the gas utility, so here's what I'm just going to be really brief. These days, there is not a direct project that you can point to that the electric fund built. Back in the day, there used to be different underground projects. We used to take money from the electric fund to build a pool, to do this, to build a fire. We used to do that. We no longer do that. The electric fund pretty much goes to the general operations of the city, and 60% of the operations of the city, the general fund, are police and fire. So I'll flat out tell you, in my opinion, your 6% goes to pay for police and fire in Leesburg.
Which is the first requirement.
Which is the first requirement of the general fund, is to provide police and fire service.
So the idea of the possibility of even reducing that 6% to say, let's say 3%, means you're going to have to find 3% elsewhere to fund police and fire.
Yes.
which would be your ad valorem, or cleaning your own house to try to get rid of staff and things like that, which
Yes,
in government.
yes,
But it's come down from about 10% to 6%.
yes.
But I'm sure if you told a Romac, we could, your electric bill over the course of next year is gonna be 3% less. I'm sure that 3% at Romac means something. Probably means something for Gourmet today. Maybe not at my residential level, 3% is not that big of a deal, but that would come at a cost, which is kind of where I've been trying to follow this whole, where are the dollars coming from, where are they going?
And from that standpoint, the reason why I think, if you, as a business owner, I don't want to necessarily like see the absolute lowest utility cost in the state of Florida at the expense of all else is because at least with utilities, everyone in the city and people outside the city pay that.
Right.
There is no homestead, there is no exemption, there is no cap on the rates, whereas frankly, yeah, that can come an ad valorem tax, which is borne almost entirely by businesses because we don't have a cap on the increases that residences do.
Well, I know we went beyond, there's a lot of good questions. A
Yeah,
lot of good
and
questions.
so just so the dichotomy, and what we're trying to do here is create an advisory board that advises the city commission, who has ultimate rate-making authority, from a group of people who is a cross-section of who the city of Leesburg provides electric to. A big electric customer, a small electric customer, a non-incorporated resident. Jack is the incorporated resident, and a Fruitland Park resident. So that's our cross-section of customer base, and we're trying to get that cross-section to influence how the city commission ultimately makes rates.
Perfect. You've got roll call on here, so what do?
You go down each member if they have any questions or any
Any
comments.
question, comments?
No comments.
Mark?
No more comments?
Dan? Four things. Are we a quasi-judicial authority here, which means that we cannot discuss anything with each other or anybody?
Technically, you are not a quasi-judicial authority because you won't deal with matters of law or legal opinion or legal matters. You are subject to the Sunshine Law,
Which means that we
which
cannot
means that you
communicate outside.
means that you cannot communicate outside of this of a advertised session and talk about issues that may come before you.
Okay.
That doesn't mean you can't talk to Jesse anymore.
No.
But it does mean you can't talk. It does mean you can't talk to Jesse anymore about electric rates.
Well, and the reason I say so, and
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
sent, I guess the gentleman that wasn't here, Jack, he's replying all. I don't think you can, we don't do that at P&Z. I mean,
Yes.
it's not good practice.
You cannot reply all. We can send out all. When you respond back, respond back to the sender only, as long as it's not another member.
Right. I just want to make sure we get the lay of the land on how we're going to operate. The legislation you spoke about, I think that'd be very good to have all the board members have that legislation that was done in Tallahassee. The PowerPoint, you can send that out, right? Okay, and
Do we have a service map?
Yes.
that'd be great.
We'd love to see, I know you were trying to describe it, but we'd love to see where the yellow lines are.
Yep.
And have we established meeting dates?
Nope. We'll talk about that real quick.
That was the four things I had.
It was service map, PowerPoint to all,
Right. Last year's legislation.
legislation.
And then you want to you might want to send out redefine
Um,
on what the committee,
Yep.
how to communicate.
Here's my thoughts. All of you had different days. This day for Jack didn't work out, so Monday. My initial thought was to do monthly meetings. We can meet as much or as little as you want. My ultimate goal is to get this commission up there, this body up to speed, so that when we get into May and June, which is budget time frame, we're talking intelligently about operations and rate making.
Well, you got it.
Our next meeting, I'll try to set up for you the first part of December, based on everybody's schedule, because I know it's the holidays. And the next thing we're going to talk about is we're going to take this, and then we're going to break it down into the distribution and utilization portion of the city of Leesburg. So tonight, I don't know if you knew, Chris Atkins is one of the deputy directors of the electric department. Brad Chase is our electric director. He couldn't be here tonight. Brad knows all this stuff anyway. And Brad's kind of taken the electric department and broken it into two sections. It's just real roughly. Support services that do SCADA, monitoring, metering, system planning. That's Chris's side of the house. And then keeping the lights on and line work. And probably everybody here knows Greg David. That's Greg David's side of the house. So the hierarchy over at electric goes Brad, Chris, Greg, and brrr. So next meeting, I'm going to have Brad come in, and he's got a similar presentation, but it's going to be Leesburg-centric. So I'm going to have the upper level supervisors of the electric department be here, and we're going to break down how we do distribution next week or next month.
You mentioned the budget. I'd send the budget out, your current budget can you do that?
Absolutely.
Because we're going to be talking about the budget anyway, and I don't know how you have it broken down in the city.
You can actually find it online, but I'll get it out to y'all specifically. I'll make it easy for you. If you go to the website leesburgflorida.gov and you go to the budget, just go to the electric fund. That's the budget.
Okay.
But I'll get it out to you.
As much information, you got smart people sitting here other than me, so I don't mind sharing the smart people. Get them as much information you can, and then it'll probably help in the process.
Absolutely.
Other than that, anything else for the good of the order?
That's it. Mike, I thank behalf of the city, thank you for
Mike.
coming in.
My pleasure.
Chris, thank you for attending. All right,
Motion to adjourn?
motion to adjourn. Thank you. So y'all want to have a second?